Hello again, everyone. In this video, we're going to take a look at exports. Exports are one of the main ways that you can back up your Oracle database. We have another video on the different strategies for the different types of backups that you can do in an Oracle database. Obviously, no one method is perfect for every situation. If there was, there would only be that one method. There's obviously different methods for different types of scenarios that are out there. Cold backups, great in some circumstances. Hot backups, great in certain circumstances. Exports are really great when you want to take a look at logical pieces that you want to back up inside your Oracle database. So an export is really good for, let's say, I just want a specific schema, or I just want a specific table or a set of tables or a couple of different schemas inside my database. I don't want to back up the whole thing. Cold backups, hot backups, using RMAN. 99% of the time you're going to be backing up your whole database. That might be overkill. Maybe you just want to back up a little piece of it. Exports and imports are really good for doing that. Probably not the type of thing that you would back up your entire database with. You could, but probably not something you would do on a regular basis. So, how do we run exports? Well, an export is, let me get my command prompt open here, is just an executable at the operating system level. So there's an export and the command line for Windows. There's one for Linux, any type of situation, any type of system that you have an Oracle database installed on, there'll be an EXP executable. Since my path is set up, I can just do EXP. And if I want to see all the different parameters that go along with export, I can do this help equals Y. Whoops, not 7. Help equals Y. And here are all the different parameters that I can pass to the export command. Oracle has added a lot of new features in the last couple of versions of the Oracle database to give you a lot more functionality inside of the export command. Import command, which we're not going to talk about in this video, but it's the same principle. I can do import help equals Y. I can see all the different imports that are available to me. So I'm going to do export help equals Y. One thing to remember is that when you're doing a cold backup or a hot backup, you're backing up operating system files. So you can manipulate those just like any other file. You can copy them, you can compress them, you can move them to tape. It's real easy to then use those operating system files when you want to recover your database. An export file, the only thing that can use an export file is the import command. So if you export a whole bunch of data that's out there and you have this export file sitting there, you can't use these other tools to recover that information. The only thing you can use is the import command. That's the only thing that understands what an export file looks like. So you have all of these different features that are available to you. And let's go through all the different parameters that are out there. So you can see here's all the keywords and their descriptions. I'm going to go through all these real quick. User ID, pretty self-explanatory. How I'm going to log into my database to start the export. Buffer size allows me to change how much Oracle is going to grab off disk as it's going through its process. So obviously if you're doing a big backup, you want to probably increase the buffer size. If you're doing a smaller backup, you can keep it smaller. Oracle will do things more efficiently there. You want to cut down on your IOs as much as possible. Any type of disk access is considered a bad thing. So we want to cut down on that as much as possible. So you can increase the buffer size if you're doing a real large backup. File, again, pretty self-explanatory. What's the actual file on my operating system that's going to hold my export? And again, you can call this anything you want. Anything that's in parentheses are the default values, so I don't have to specify the file parameter on my command line. It will just default to that. Compress, same thing, has a default value. You can see everything here that has a Y or an N. Anything in parentheses is the default value. Do I want to compress the information into one extent? It's hard to explain, especially in this video, how Oracle stores things at the disk level, but extents are basically allocated pieces of your data file for a specific table or for a specific segment. A segment is anything inside your Oracle database that takes up space in the data files. So tables are segments, indexes are segments, views are not segments because views are just ways of looking at existing segments, existing tables inside your system. So a view doesn't physically take up space in the data file, so it's not considered a segment. Oracle will pre-allocate space inside of the data files for your table. So when you create a table, Oracle goes ahead and it grabs a chunk of the data file. Even though you haven't inserted any rows into it yet, it says, okay, this 10 megs is going to be for table X. And when those 10 megs fill up, it grabs another piece of the data file, and it's called an extent. So you can have a whole bunch of extents. If you're doing a tremendous amount of inserts and updates and deletes to a table, you'll have a whole bunch of extents that are associated with a segment, in this case a table inside your database. If I say compress equals y, what Oracle will do is it'll grab all of those different pieces of information, all those extents for, let's say, table X, and it'll store them in one extent. So when it comes time for me to import it, it won't import all these different extents all over the data files. It'll create one extent to hold the initial set of data for me. So normally you want to say compress equals y. There's very rare circumstances where you would say compress equals no, but 99% of the time you want to say compress equals y. Grants, the privileges that go along with a particular table or index or whatever segment that you're talking about inside your database. Do you want to export all of those also? This can cause a problem if the database that you're going to import the information to doesn't have those users. So you may have granted user Steve the select capabilities on my table X. Well, if I export the grants and then I go to another database and I can do an import and Steve doesn't exist in that database, it'll give you an error. It'll give you a warning. It won't stop the import from proceeding, but you'll see all of these warnings on the screen about missing users on the system. Indexes, again, pretty self-explanatory. Do I want to export the indexes that go along with the table? If I want to rebuild the indexes on my target database, I obviously don't want to waste time and space exporting the indexes. Direct path equals no. That's the default value. What direct does is it says, okay, I'm not going to go through all of the normal processing that Oracle does when it queries information. When Oracle queries information, it pulls the data into the SGA in memory. It keeps that block in there. For doing an export, I don't particularly care if that information is in memory. I just want to just grab the information out of the data files and as quickly as I can get it into my export file. So it defaults to no, but 99% of the time you probably want to say direct equals y. It really gives you a performance increase. Why would I ever want to set direct equal to no? Well, about the only time you'd want to set direct equal to no is if you use this query clause here. We're going to talk about querying a little bit, but query gives you the ability to say, okay, not only do I want a specific table out of my database, but I want to write a query that says, okay, just give me these rows that match this criteria. So I might say, I want to import all my employees, but I just want to grab all of my employees who are in Department 10. I can do that. I can set up a query that says just limit the information that I'm going to export. In that case, I can't use direct equals y, because Oracle has to, by the very nature of a query, it has to do some processing on all of the information that it reads out of the data files. But 99% of the time, you probably want to have direct equals to y. Log file, I want to write out a log file that shows everything that I did as part of my export. You'll see it on the screen, but sometimes you want to see it in a file also to check for errors. You can certainly do that. It doesn't have to be specified. Rows, export data rows, defaults to y. Why in the world would you ever want to not export the data? Isn't that the whole point of an export? Well, one of the things you can do with export is just export the structure of your database, the tables, the indexes, the triggers, everything else that goes along, but you don't really care about the data. You just want to get the structure of your database inside of an export file that you can then import into, let's say, a test environment where you can recreate all of the structures and then input the data as you need to. I can say rows equals no, and Oracle will just export the metadata that goes along with all my structures inside my database without actually exporting the data. Consistent. This is a real tricky one. A lot of times an export will run for a significant period of time. If you have a really large export, it could run for, let's say, hours as it's going through and it's processing all the information. Well, what if I have a parent-child table and I input information into both the parent and the child? Let's say I'm doing an order. So I got an order and a child table with line items that are associated with that particular order. In the beginning of my export, I may have already exported the order table. And then 45 minutes later, I get around to the line items table. Well, in that 45-minute period, somebody inputted a new order. So now I missed that new order It's not in my orders table because it was done after the export was running and I already passed the orders table, but I haven't reached the line items table yet. So now I hit the line items table. Well, guess what? I have inconsistent data. I'll have line items that are associated with an order, but my export doesn't have that order information. So when I try to do the import, I'm going to have problems. You can say consistent equals Y, and Oracle will basically take a snapshot of what's going on inside your database and make sure that the data is consistent across the board. Slows things down a lot because Oracle is constantly checking, okay, did this record get updated? What's the timestamp? What's going on here? So it slows things down a lot, but if you're doing a large export on a table or a database that has a lot of transactions going on, you're going to have to make sure that consistent is set to Y, or else there's a real good chance you're going to wind up with inconsistent data inside your export file, and you're not going to know about it until you try to do an import somewhere. Full, again, gives me the ability to do an entire export of my entire database. Unless your database is pretty small, you probably don't want to do this. You probably want to use some other backup method to back up your database. Owner and tables are exactly what it sounds like. Gives me the ability to logically say, okay, I don't want to back up the whole database. I just want to grab a particular owner or a set of owners or a table or a set of tables that are associated with those owners. I have the ability to go in and at a granular level say what I want to actually have as part of my export. And that goes along with this query statement that we had mentioned earlier, where I can say for table X, run this query and say, for my employees table, just give me all the employees who are department 10, and I can put that as part of my query. Really cool feature. Record length is important if you're going to move your export file between operating systems. You can export data, let's say, from a database that's running on Windows, move that file over to a Linux box, and then import it into a database over there. Really cool feature. The trick is operating systems store information a little differently, so it's necessary when you transfer the export file to another operating system that uses different values. If you set the record length consistent and you specify it here as part of the export, you can specify it as part of the import, and even if you're on different operating systems, everything will sync up okay. Incremental type and record, these guys go together. I can specify, do I want the export command to maintain information about the records that I've exported? If I leave the default set to Y, I can then do an incremental type the next time I have to do an export. The different values that are available for you in the incremental type are complete, cumulative, and incremental. And it's exactly what it sounds like. If I've done an export, let's say, on a Sunday night at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then I do another export on Monday at 3 o'clock in the morning, if I just specify the export without specifying anything for my incremental type, it'll back up everything, so I'll have duplicate information. If I want to cut down on my exports, I can say, do an incremental export. And Oracle will be smart enough to say, oh, I just need to export these records that have either changed, they've been updated, records that have been deleted, records that have been inserted. So it speeds up your export because you're only going to get the different files since your previous export. It makes importing a lot trickier because you have to do your original import, then you have to do the first incremental import, then the second incremental import to get all your data back. But it's a way of making exports and imports a lot easier to use if that's going to be your main backup strategy. Triggers are pieces of code that are associated with a table, so I can say, okay, every time I insert a row into this table, do something else. Every time I update a row in this table, do something else. Maybe it's maintain audit information about who changed the record, what was changed, what was the previous value, what was the new value, if I need to recover for whatever reason. Do I want to export the trigger information that's associated with my tables? Statistics. The Oracle engine maintains information about the tables, and this metadata of information influences how Oracle goes after rows inside your database. If there's very few rows in a table, let's say, and even if I have an index, Oracle might say, you know what, it's easier for me just to do a full table scan. I'm not even going to bother doing the indexes, and vice versa. So Oracle maintains all the statistical information, but it's not dynamic. You have to go in there and rebuild the statistics on a regular basis. One of the really nice features of export is that I can export the statistical information and analyze the objects as I'm doing the export. So when it comes time for me to do the import in some other database, the statistical information is already there. So it's a very efficient way of importing information and having the optimizer say, okay, I understand what this table looks like, and I have already the best idea of how to get information when I have to query information. I can specify all of these different things on a command line. I can also put them into a parameter file. So if I'm using this over and over again, I don't want to have to type indexes equals y, direct equals no, log equals this, buffer equals this. I can store all that stuff in a parameter file and then just reference that parameter file when it comes time for me to do my import or export. Constraints are things that are put on a table. Normally you want to export those, but again, I have the ability to not export those if I'm not interested. I can say constraints equals no. Typical constraints are things like foreign key indexes, check constraints that are built into your table. Most of the times you want to grab that, but you have the option of doing that if you don't want to. The second half here are some of the new features that Oracle has added in just the most recent releases of the export command, and it has some really cool features. If I say object consistent equals to y, the transaction set to read only during an object export. So when Oracle says, okay, I'm starting to export table X, I'm not going to allow any transactions to go against that table. I'm going to have a really solid read consistent view of that table. Now it can affect other people who are actively working on your database. They might get these weird error messages on your system, but that's obviously something that you might have to have if it's really important to maintain your data integrity inside your database. Feedback, display progress every X rows. If you're doing a real long export, sometimes it looks like it's just sitting there doing nothing. So you might want to say, I want to have some kind of feedback after every 500 rows. And all Oracle does is it puts a little dot on the bottom of the screen. So every 500 rows, you'll see another dot along the bottom of the screen just to give you an indication that the export hasn't locked up, it's actually doing something. I can specify the file size. This isn't a big deal now. Years ago, it used to be a big deal where a lot of Unix systems had a file limit of 2 gigabytes. If you wanted to do an export that was bigger than that, it would hit the 2 gigabyte limit and then it would error out because the operating system didn't know how to handle anything like that. If I specify a file size of, let's say, 1.5 gigabytes, it'll create multiple export files for me. Flashback, system change number, flashback time gives me the ability to set a session snapshot back to. And the second one here is the time used to get the system change number closest to a specified time. Gives me the ability to go in there and say, you know what, I want an export, but I want the table to be exported as it was 30 minutes ago or 45 minutes ago. And if you've stored all of that information in your database, and that's a whole other video, you can actually do cool things like that. Resumable allows me to say, okay, if I run out of space as I'm doing my export, don't give me an error message and error out. Display something on the screen, give me the ability to go in there and say, okay, I'll clear up some file space and then I can resume my export. And that goes along with a resumable name and resumable timeout. Transportable table spaces gives me the ability to go in there, and you can see there's this other one here called transportable table space. This gives me the ability to export the metadata that's associated with a table space. Why would you ever want to do something like that? Well, a real quick way of moving data in between systems is I can take the data files, and let's say I'll take the data file from one system, move the data file to another system. Well, if you do that, Oracle isn't smart enough to say, oh, there's a new data file here, I'm just going to pick up all that information. It has to know inside its dictionary, hey, there's this new data file there. So a really cool way of moving files between systems and data between systems really easily is to use transportable table spaces. And what that allows you to do is say, I'm just going to take the metadata, I'll move the metadata to this other database, I'll move the data file to this other database, import the metadata, and then Oracle knows, oh, I have this new data file here that wasn't here, 2 hours ago, and it's part of my database. There's a couple other things you have to do to make sure that all works, but it's a real cool feature. I can also establish templates that go along with the application server mode export. That's something that isn't really used that much, but it's a nice feature that's out there if you're exporting the data that's associated with the application server on a regular basis. You can do that. So let's run through a real quick export here just to show you what it looks like. So what are the things that I'm going to specify? Well, I have to specify who I'm going to log in as. So I'm going to log in as the OE user to my sandbox. I don't have to specify a file name, but I'm going to anyway. I'm going to say file equals chris1.exp. I'm going to take the default grants, indexes, compress. I'm going to say direct equals y because I'm not doing any kind of queries or anything like that. This isn't going to be that big, so I'm not going to write out a log file. I can just look at the screen. Table consistency, again, I'm going to do something small. I'm not going to do the entire database, so I'm going to leave full to no. But under owner, I'm going to say, you know what, I want to grab the OE user, and I also want to grab the AR user. This is going to give us an error message. Under normal circumstances, unless the OE user has been granted DBA privileges, which they haven't in this particular case, I can't export another user, but I'm just going to put it in there to show you the type of error message that I would see. I can specify tables. I'm not going to do that. Record length, incremental type, records, constraints. I'm going to leave everything else the way it is right now. So if I try to do something like this, I get an error message that say non-DBAs may not export other users. So because the OE user doesn't have DBA privileges, he can't export the AR user. So I'm going to go back here. I'm just going to take AR off, and I'm just going to grab the OE user. And you can see it's relatively fast. It goes through, grabs all of the different information. It lists all of the different objects, database links, numbers. Let me scroll back here so you can see some of this information. Any type of synonyms, any type of sequence numbers, clusters, definitions. This OE user owns a whole bunch of tables. So here's the tables. Here's the number of rows that are exported. I get these warnings that say, you know, the statistics on some of these tables don't really look too good. So you asked me to export statistics, so I'll do it. But it doesn't look like they've been updated in a while. So Oracle is just trying to give you a little bit of a warning there. Synonyms, views, stored procedures, exports everything else out of the database. If I do a directory now on star.exp, you can see there's my Chris1 that I just exported, 3 megs of all the data in the files. Another good thing about export is that it takes the smallest amount of disk space to store the information. When you do a cold or a hot backup, you're storing a lot of information at the file system level. So if you have a 1 gigabyte data file, it's 99% empty. The operating system doesn't know it's 99% empty. It just knows it's a 1 gig file. Doing exports gives you a real nice way of compressing the size of what you're exporting outside of your database. But the export command, really nice command, allows you to logically get different pieces out of your database. Probably not the strategy you use to back up your entire database, but it really gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of what you want to actually back up as part of your database.